Working with translations. We'll talk first of all about the translations of the Bible, and then, okay, yeah, D.S. Timothy Kim, you just keep coming unmuted, and it echoes. Maybe check, make sure the microphone's off. Try to turn all the microphones off in Pompeii. If you're in the same room, it's going to keep echoing. Okay. So, translation. Translation basically is to go from one language to take the meaning of that language and to transfer that to another language. That can be a big challenge for us because the Bible was written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Hebrew, most of the Old Testament, 99.9% of the Old Testament is Hebrew. And then there's just a few parts that are Aramaic. Aramaic and Hebrew are very similar. They use the same lettering. It's kind of like two dialects of the same language. And then Greek is much different, and we'll learn about these languages. These languages from the Bible are dead languages. That means they're not spoken anymore. Now, Hebrew and Greek are modern languages, but modern Hebrew and Greek are much different than ancient Hebrew and Greek. That'd be like English speakers trying to understand, not even before Shakespeare. I can't even understand Shakespeare or the King James Bible, but go back like 1,000 years, and the English language is not even similar to what it is today. That's the same with Hebrew and Greek. So these are called Biblical Hebrew and Koine Greek. There's very few people who actually can read the biblical languages. It takes at least 2 years of full-time study to be able to understand these biblical languages enough to translate. It takes a lot of work. I know Greek a lot better than I know Hebrew. I have studied Aramaic, but it was quite a while ago. So since we cannot just pick up the Greek New Testament and read it, we have to rely on translations in the modern languages. And this will create for us many challenges. Here are some challenges to think about. Just think about languages in general. First of all, translation always involves interpretation. Anytime you go from one language to the other, something's going to be missing in that. Those of you who speak another language, you know all about this. I know we have almost everyone in this class speaks another language. My other languages are not very good, but almost everyone else in this class, you know Korean, you know Tagalog, Cebuano, all kinds of other languages that are represented in this class. You know what it's like to try to express your idea that's in your home, your mother language, your heart language, how difficult it is to take that and put it into English, for example. There's always something that's lost. You have to choose which words represent the original and to take that to the new language. So there's always some degree of interpretation. That's important to remember when it comes to interpreting the Bible, because whatever translation we use, we have to understand that choices have to be made according to what we think those words represent. Number two, no two languages have the same vocabulary and grammar. Greek is a little closer to English than Hebrew, and we'll learn about that in a few minutes, why that is. If a language is part of the same family, then there's some similarities. But if they are part of a different family of languages, it's very difficult to translate. Often, you might have like one word in the original language, and it's going to take like 5 or 6 words in the other language to express that one word. It's not always a 1 equals 1. It might be a 1 equals 5 or more. It's complicated. Number 3, words have different meanings depending on their context. You might have a word that occurs in one place in the Bible, and then it occurs in a different place, but it has a whole different meaning to it. The whole range of meanings is called the semantic domain. An author will choose a word's nuance from that circle, that semantic domain. It's difficult and sometimes impossible to determine what nuance of a word an author intended. It's easy to miss this in translations. Sometimes that's why one translation will say one thing, and then you pick up another translation and it has a little bit different perspective. That's because the translators are trying to figure out how these languages relate to one another. Number 4, the best way to know the possible translation of a word is to study the biblical languages. Well, since most people don't have the time or the perhaps the ability or possibility of studying Hebrew and Greek, then we're going to have to use some tools to help us. The next best thing is to use translation tools, interlinears, concordances, word studies, and I'll show you how to do some of that, maybe even this hour. A third way is to compare modern translations. For example, English translations. So we'll do that too in a few minutes. Let's talk about the biblical languages. First of all, Hebrew. Hebrew was a Northwest Semitic language, and it shares the same family of languages as Phoenician, Ugaritic, Aramaic, and Amorite. It was spoken and written primarily in Canaan. As I said, more than 99% of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. The most common version that scholars use today is this one. It's called the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, and it's abbreviated BHS. The reason it's called this is that it comes out of the German Bible Society. So you open it up, and actually you start at the end of the Bible. That's because Hebrew goes from left to right, so the front of the Bible is what we call the back. So you open up the back cover, and you open up the page, and then you find the title page. So it's all backwards. So this is the portable version of it. You can see, I don't know if you can see in the video too well. You might have the notes open, but you can switch screens up at the top right corner, and you can see the Hebrew. The order of the Hebrew Bible is different than the English Bible. We talked a little bit about that last week also. So not very many people can use this. It's pretty complex. I don't use it very often. I had to pull this off the shelf. It takes quite a bit of hard study to be able to translate the Hebrew, but it's possible, and I encourage anyone who wants to do that. This particular version is based on the Leningrad Codex. A codex is a book, is a bunch of papers or parchments that were sewn on the edge. So the ancient manuscripts, they were stacked on top of each other, and then they were sewn on the edge like that. That's called a codex. Modern books basically are codices. The ancient Jews used scrolls, but the Christians preferred codices, that's the plural, codices, because then they could flip it open easy. So the Leningrad Codex is the oldest complete manuscript of the Old Testament, dating to 1008 AD. And the reason it's called Leningrad, because that's where it's kept now. It's in the safe place in Leningrad, Russia. So I think it's there still. I'm not sure. You'd have to look it up. But it's a very important ancient manuscript. And everything that we have today is based on that. There have been 4 major periods of Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew, that's what we're concerned about. That was from the year 1300 to 200 BC. Then there was Mishnaic or Rabbinical Hebrew, and that was not really spoken so much. The more common language of the time of Jesus was Aramaic. That was the common language. Medieval Hebrew from 800 to 1800, and then modern Hebrew. It began when Israel became a nation again in 1948. So it is becoming more standardized as people use it in Israel today. So for many centuries, Hebrew was not really spoken that much, just by maybe a few people. But now it's kind of being rebirthed as a modern language. The script of it is called Paleo-Hebrew. I don't know, it's hard to see, but it's very square. I don't know if you can see that very well in the video. But the letters are square and little tails and so on. The lettering is nowhere even close to what we would recognize. And this was borrowed from the Phoenicians. This script can be seen in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which uses this ancient script. Oh, the earliest, I'm sorry, this is not the Phoenician script. This is the square script, the Aramaic. So this took over in 200 BC. The earlier one is kind of curvy and a little more difficult to, at least for me, I can't recognize it very well. And then in Hebrew also, I should have copied and pasted this, but actually I know what I could do to bring this up to show you an example real quick. I'll open my Logos software and show you, instead of this book is hard to see on the screen. So now, I think everyone can see this. This is from Psalm 6. So let's turn to the one we did today, Psalm 119, verse 25. Okay. So now this is the psalm that we looked at today. So notice, so Hebrew goes from right to left, okay? Right to left. Look at the first letter of all of these verses. It all starts the same, doesn't it? It begins with a dalet. That's the D sound. Every word, because Psalm 119 is an acrostic. And then the next section all begins with the letter Hey. You see that? And then we come to the next section. Starts with the letter Vav. So Hebrew goes from right to left, and these little vowel points, they're kind of hard to see, but they're the little dots and dashes between the letters. Those were added by the Masoretes, who were a group of rabbis. They were added in the about AD 500 because they wanted to preserve the pronunciation of the Hebrew. Here's some basic characteristics of Hebrew. Hebrew is based on roots of 3 consonants. If you want to change the meaning of a word, you'd add something to the beginning, a prefix, or perhaps a suffix at the bottom, or you would change the vowel points, and that would change the meaning of the word. So let me bring up, maybe I'll just show you this again so you can at least know what I'm talking about. Most of these Hebrew words then would be based on 3 consonants. The consonants are the big ones. Okay, so here's one that has 3 consonants. This has 3, but these last 2, I don't know if you can see the cursor very well. These last 2 in that word, those are personal endings. Those are not the root. So this one, again, it has this personal ending at the end, but these first 3 are the consonants. So most Hebrew words have 3 consonants. Sometimes you get one with 4, and sometimes one has 2 consonants. But most of the time, it has 3. Here's one that has 3. Again, this one has 3, but it has added words, consonants and vowel points, because it's probably a verb or something. So it looks like Hebrew is kind of more primitive, and it is. It's a simpler language, and that makes it good for telling a story, but it's not so good for like philosophical, deep theological ideas. Greek was better for the philosophy and so on. The normal word order in Hebrew, you get the verb, subject, and object. Verb almost always comes first. That's interesting for interpretation because the verb is emphasized. It's important. So I heard one teacher tell me, if you want to preach on the Old Testament, preach from the verbs, the actions, because they're so important in the Hebrew language. So the verb is central and important in Hebrew. Let's skip down to Aramaic. Aramaic was also a Northwest Semitic language, very similar to Hebrew. In the past, scholars did not see it in the Bible because all the letters were the same. But after a while, they began to understand that the grammar and the vocabulary is just a little bit different. The Assyrians, when they gained power in the 8th century BC, they made Aramaic the international language. And eventually, it became the major language of the Middle East until when Greek became the international language. There's only a few places in the Old Testament that has Aramaic. One verse in Genesis, one verse in Jeremiah, a couple of chapters in Ezra, and then a big chunk in the middle of Daniel. So those are the only places in the Old Testament that have the Aramaic language. And then there are 5 words in the New Testament. The name Cephas, which is Peter, Tabitha, Maranatha, Ephtapha, Talitha, Kumi. Those are the only ones. And then Rabbi is also Aramaic. This was the native language of Jesus and the disciples, was Aramaic. And then we come to the language of Greek. Greek is an Indo-European language. So it is similar, has a lot of similarities to the European languages. French, German, English, Spanish, and so on, Latin. They're all part of the same language tree. There are different periods of Greek. Early Greek, classical Greek, that's the one that Homer and some of the classical philosophers used, like Plato and so on. And then Koine Greek. Koine Greek is what the New Testament was written. The word koine means common. It was the everyday language out on the street. That's what people used. It included some parts of other languages, just like languages today. So Koine Greek. Koine Greek, different than classical Greek, and a lot different than early Greek. And then later on, beginning in the year 330 AD, up until the Middle Ages, was Byzantine Greek. And it was the major language of the eastern part of the Roman Empire for over 1,000 years. The largest number of New Testament manuscripts were written during the Byzantine period. And then there's modern Greek, which began in the year 1453. And today it's only spoken by about 15 million people. It's not a very big language in Greece and Cyprus. So Greek as a language has almost died in the world. The characteristics of Greek. Greek, especially classical and Koine, is highly inflectional. What that means is that you can change a word, add letters to it, prefix, suffix. It's very flexible when it comes to changing the word. The basic root words are modified by prefixes at the beginning, infixes, something in the middle is changed, and then suffixes at the end. And from that, you can make all kinds of grammatical forms. It uses a lot of adjectives and adverbs. Adjectives, remember that those describe a noun, and adverbs describe the action of a verb. So Greek has lots of adverbs and adjectives, which makes it very good for doing philosophy and theology, to describe abstract ideas. Koine was not pure Greek, but it adapted many cultures with it. The structure of the language from its classical era and the variety of vocabulary, oh yeah, I already mentioned that. It's very good for theology. So it helped the New Testament writers, for example, to express complex ideas. Okay, let me bring up for you the Greek also. Let me stop this and bring up this program. Okay, so here is the Greek New Testament. I was last trying to figure out something from 1 Corinthians chapter 14, but let's just do an easy verse that a lot of people know. John chapter 1, verse 1. So you can notice, if you've never studied Greek before, that some of these letters look almost like English. That epsilon, E, that looks like a V, but it's actually the N sound. You could learn the Greek alphabet probably within 30 minutes. And probably within an hour or two, you'd be able to read this out loud. You wouldn't know what it means, but you could at least pronounce the words. So Greek has these little symbols above and sometimes below the words. Those are accents and breathing marks. So every Greek word will have an accent of some type. So Greek is similar to English. The word order is more it is more for emphasis. You might have the verb at the beginning of the verse or at the end or in the middle. Generally, it's fairly clear. So this says, in arche ein halagos. In the beginning was the word. You might even recognize the word logos there. So that word is repeated. Logos here. And then we have theos. You know what theology is. So theos is God. You would be surprised how many Greek words you know. And you, just because they're so close to English. So the word en, it's the same thing as the word in English. I-N and E-N. You probably know, without studying the New Testament Greek, you probably know hundreds of words that you could translate without having to look them up in Greek or in a dictionary because they're so close to English. So that's just a brief introduction to the Greek. And I'll show you in a few minutes, if you don't know these biblical languages, well, how can you use this stuff for your study? So maybe I'll do that right now. Let's open up my web browser and show you a very helpful website. Let's say you want to study John chapter 1, verse 1. The website, if you can see this, is blueletterbible.org. Have you ever used this website before? blueletterbible.org. This website, and there's others like it, but this website is worth a lot to a Bible student because there's so much you can do here. So let's look up John chapter 1, verse 1. And we'll use as our base text the English Standard Version because it's more literal. And we'll learn about that in just a moment too. So don't worry about that. So we'll look this up in the English Standard Version. Okay, so now we have the flow of John chapter 1 and the different verses here. And it gives us the English Standard Version translation. We could change that up here if we want. But let's say we want to find out what these words are in the original Greek. But we don't know Greek. We don't have a Greek New Testament. Oh, I should show you. This is what the Greek New Testament looks like. Okay. So it has the same thing as the program that I showed you just a moment ago. All right, so what we want to do then is over on the left side, there is this box that says tools there. And it gives us 6 options: interlinear, Bibles, cross-references, commentaries, dictionaries, and miscellaneous. This will all be related to John chapter 1, verse 1. So the interlinear, let's choose that. Now we have the English, and it uses the NASB on the left, which is also fairly literal. It has the Greek sentence up front, up on top here. But it has the English over on the left side. You see where my cursor is? Right here, it gives the inflected, root, and transliterated. Transliteration is, it might be a little hard to see. I'm going to see if I can blow this up a little bit, make it easier for you to see. There, yeah, that's better. Okay. Transliteration is when you take the Greek letters and put it into English. Okay, so epsilon nu, when you put that into English, becomes E and N. The next word, RK, when you put that into English letters, there it is right there. Okay, so that gives you the Greek. This probably even gives you the pronunciation. I don't know. I don't know what that does.
Strong's G 1722 N.
Nice. It even gives you the pronunciation. Let's see what he does with a bigger word here.
Strong's G 746 Arche.
Okay. Yeah, so they even give you the Greek pronunciation. That's nice. But the important word, the important thing here, if you do not know the Greek, is the Strong's number. Every word in the New Testament and the Old Testament will have a number assigned to it. And Mr. Strong, whenever he lived a long time ago, sometime in the 20th century, I think, or before, he went through and numbered every word in the Bible. So we might not know what this word is in Greek, but we can click on this. This G stands for Greek 746. And in the English, it says, in the beginning. So let's click on it. Now it gives us the pronunciation, arche, pronunciation, arche. Part of speech, it's a feminine noun. That gives us the root, and we can look that up also if we click on that. We go down further, it shows all the different ways it occurs in the Bible, New Testament, the different forms. Wow, this is really valuable. I wish I had this as a student. And then towards the bottom here, it gives you a basic definition: beginning, principality, corner, first, miscellaneous. And it uses the King James as the basis for that, which is okay. King James is kind of old English, but it's all free, so I won't complain. You can go down further, and it gives you a Strong's definition of the word. It means a commencement or chief, a beginning, a corner, the first, magistrate, power, principality, principle, or rule. Now, this is what you call the semantic domain. That means all of these fit within the circle of the meaning of this word. And we as translators need to determine which of these words does it fit in John chapter 1, verse 1. Not all of these words will fit. In the beginning was the magistrate. Nah, that doesn't fit too well. In the beginning was the rule. No, it doesn't fit too well. In the beginning was the corner. No. In the beginning was in the beginning. I was saying that all wrong. So we say in the corner was the word. No, that doesn't work, does it? In the power. Well, that's a little bit, a little bit. But the one that seems to fit the best is in the beginning. And indeed, that's what most translations put there. We can go down further, and now we have more definitions on where this word occurs. We'll look at word studies in a couple, probably next week. I'm just showing you very briefly about translations. And then we see here at the bottom where this word occurs in all of these verses. So it's a fairly common word in the New Testament, used in a lot of different ways. This is all free. We'll do some more work in that kind of thing too. Okay. Let's go back to the notes then. So remember Blue Letter Bible, and it has a lot of other kinds of resources there for you to use if you like. So that's Greek. Those are the biblical languages that we work with. Let's look at a short history of Bible translation. The first translation that we hear about actually took place in the Bible itself, in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8, verse 8. Ezra was reading the Hebrew Bible and was explaining it. We'll just look up that verse here real quick. And he was explaining it or translating it to those who were there. Oh, Nehemiah. I opened the Bible to Ezra 8:8, and it's just a list of names. So I gotta get the right book here. They read from the book of the law of God, which was written in Hebrew, and giving the meaning so the people understood what was being read. This was a new generation. They didn't know Hebrew very well because they had grown up in Babylon. They had to learn all of that. And so they interpreted, translated, explained the Old Testament law to the people who came back from exile. This was the standard practice used in the synagogues. So someone would read the Old Testament in the synagogue, and then they would explain it. They would interpret it, sometimes translate it. By the first century, this became known as targums, where these translations and these interpretations were written down in books. The targums were more literal for the law part of the Old Testament and paraphrases for the writings. And if you want to, you can actually look at these at this website. You can look up what these targums are, and it's called the Aramaic Bible. So that's the Hebrew Bible. And then another very important document is known as the Septuagint. It is abbreviated LXX. LXX is the Roman number for 70. Here's why it's called the 70. The first written translation of the Bible that we know that was the translation of the Hebrew Bible into the Greek. And that translation took place about the 3rd century BC. And it became known as the Septuagint. It's very important for us because, first of all, it was the first written translation of the Bible, the Old Testament, that is. It provided a theological vocabulary for Judaism and Christianity. There were a lot of important words like church, ecclesia, is in the Septuagint. Agape, love. They were all based out of the Septuagint. So the Christians took those important words, brought them over into the New Testament, and then they, interpreted those words from the perspective of a Christian and fulfillment in Jesus. So a lot of our Christian vocabulary actually comes from the Greek translation known as the Septuagint. The LXX allowed the Bible, Old Testament, to be read in the common language of from Mesopotamia, way over in Babylon area, all the way over to Spain. The Greek language was spoken all throughout that area. Between 400 and 600 years, that was the main language. When they translated the Old Testament into Greek, then Jews from across the Roman Empire and before the Roman Empire could read the Old Testament. At some point, the Septuagint included the Apocrypha, and we talked about that last week. The Septuagint was the Old Testament for the Christian church. The earliest Christians who went out into the Roman Empire, like Paul the Apostle, they used the Septuagint as their Bible. And so it was the church, it was the Bible of the early church, except perhaps those Jews who lived in Jerusalem and Israel. Okay, there are other ancient versions. We don't need to go over this in any detail. But there are other versions and then other translations that began to go out. One important one that I should mention is number 7. That is when the Septuagint, when the Bible, and this would be the whole Bible by this point, Old and New Testament, was translated into Latin. And this became known as the Vulgate. So 2 important translations, Septuagint, Greek, Vulgate, Latin. This was translated by the early church father named Jerome. There are many translations going around, but they use very poor quality. It was not very accurate. And so Pope Damascus asked Jerome to revise the Latin Bible. So what Jerome did is he moved to Bethlehem and he learned Hebrew. That way he could translate directly from Hebrew into Latin, not go through all these other languages. Because you can imagine what happens when you go from Hebrew to Greek to Latin. Something's going to change. So it's better if you go straight from the Hebrew to the Latin. And that's what Jerome did. This became the Bible of the church, the Western church, for 1,000 years. In fact, for Roman Catholics today, it's still the official Bible, the Latin Vulgate. So this was a very important translation that Jerome did, very influential. And so it was the Bible of the Christian church for over 1,000 years, and still influential today. Well, let's talk about modern translations. This is what we actually have, in our hands, modern translations. As you can imagine, it's a challenge to go from the biblical languages to whatever language we have today. We'll talk about English, but this is true if you go to Korean or Tagalog or Cebuano or any other language. One helpful website I want to point out is Bible Gateway. I use Bible Gateway every day. I don't think there's a day goes by that I don't use Bible Gateway. You see, it's the first one under my favorites. It's my go-to Bible. I use Bible Gateway more than I use a printed Bible. I just always have it open because it's quick and fast and easy. One thing nice about Bible Gateway is that there's so many languages available. You can see all these English ones, but they also have Spanish. They have, there's Korean, I think there's Korean in here, Japanese. I think they might have Tagalog, I'm not sure. But all these, a whole bunch of Chinese ones, all kinds of modern translations. One thing I like to do sometimes is if I'm studying a verse and I'm not quite sure how to understand it very well, let's just pick a verse like maybe John 1:14. And I'll put it in the search box. Get rid of that over there. And there it is in the ESV. One thing I like, though, about this website is look here at the bottom. It says John 1:14 in all English translations. Click on that. Now you see this verse in all of these English translations. So you can compare. So sometimes I would compare like the contemporary English version. The Word became a human being and lived here with us. You can compare that to something like the Phillips, which is a paraphrase. So the Word of God became a human being and lived among us. Similar. The Message is definitely a paraphrase. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. All right, we're going to have new neighbors. So this is definitely a paraphrase. It's not literal. The ESV that I use quite often, it's fairly literal. It's close to the Greek. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The NIV, which is very common, is it's not quite literal in some places. It's close, but not quite. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. These are probably close enough that you can't see the difference, but sometimes the difference shows up quite a bit. Some of these translations, I don't even know what they are. We have to click on them to find out what they are. Here's the WYC. I'm not sure what that is. The Word was made man and dwelled among us. So you can, when you see a difference in translation, that's a good idea then to go look up the word. For example, sometimes we have human being here, and sometimes we have flesh. Sometimes we have here is the home, residence, lived among us, dwelt among us, dwelling among us, lived among us. We saw a neighborhood. When I see a big difference like that, that's a good clue for me to go to the interlinear Bible, like blueletterbible.org. And then I could go and look what the actual Greek is. So we can see all of these different English translations at this website. It can be helpful if you're doing a word study, or if you just want a different interpretation of that particular verse. So I find that a helpful website that I use just about every day. BibleGateway.com. There are two major philosophies to translation. The first one is called formal. A formal translation is more literal. It tries to get as close as it can in the English as it can to the biblical languages. It tries to go 1 = 1 as close as possible, or 1 is about equal to 1. Sometimes it's not always possible, but it tries to get as close as it can. The goal of this approach is to translate each word of the original language into the new language as much as possible, and you keep the same sentence structure, you keep the same word order as much as you can. Sometimes you have to change the order, but it tries to be as close as you can. The other approach is called a functional approach. This is where it's more idea for idea, not word for word, but idea for idea. It's more idiomatic, or that means it's taking more of how people speak today. People do not speak formal King James Version translation. Most people say street language. So functional translations try to get how people talk today, every day. And so it's more of a thought for thought, trying to get the meaning across. Not necessarily the words, but the meaning. So here we can lay it out. Formal equivalence is literal. Functional equivalence is dynamic. Formal equivalence focuses on the words and the grammar. Functional equivalence focuses on the meaning. Formal privileges the original language. That means it emphasizes the original language. Functional emphasizes the modern language. Formal, more attentive to the original context and how all the language flows. Functional is more focused on the contemporary context where we live today. Formal retains ambiguities. That means it leaves things unclear, which can be difficult for Bible study. The functional, it shows more interpretive biases of the translators. And then finally, the formal, it tries to imitate how the author wrote. But the functional is more contemporary style, how people talk and write today. There's a third category that's not really even a translation. It's called a paraphrase. And so it's way off the chart. I mean, and we'll look at this chart here in a minute. So look at this chart. This is where common English translations fit. So you might be surprised, but the King James Version is fairly literal. It's just that the language is old. So if you take out the these and the thous, with the New King James, it's fairly literal. It's good for doing very detailed Bible study. So the NASB, the New King James, and the ESV. I use the ESV a lot of times for my serious study because I want it to be as close to the original languages as I can without having to go look things up and try to figure that out. I just want something real fast and easy that I know is going to be fairly literal. Now, what does that do? It makes these three translations difficult, especially, for example, if you preach. I have preached from the English Standard Version. I get up and I get ready to read the Bible, and I have to translate English into English because it doesn't read very well. And sometimes it has big words. So I'm finding myself, as I read the English Standard Version, paraphrasing it because I know the people out in the congregation won't understand it. So I don't find it's very good to preach from, but it's good to study from because it's fairly close to what the Greek and Hebrew would be. Now, notice where the NIV is. This is very popular among Christians today. It's right in the middle. That means it's fairly close to a literal, but it also leans towards more of the contemporary language. It's more of a thought for thought, not a word for word. So there might be the idea in the original language, and the NIV, it may not be word for word, but it tries to capture the main idea. The problem is that sometimes it takes too much liberty, and it's not an accurate translation, in my opinion. That's why it's always helpful to compare translations if you're doing a serious study. Bible Gateway, real easy. All you need to do is just click on different translation, and you can see that. Well, way over here on the side is the Message. The Message is more of a paraphrase. It's not literal. It tries to capture the main idea, but it might have a whole paragraph for one verse because it's talking about the neighborhood or something like that. So it's not good for serious study, but it's good for trying to understand how to, or what it means for us today. So just different perspectives there. If you have a favorite Bible, if you use the English, that is, you could perhaps see where it fits in here. Now, this chart, I've seen it on the internet, and I should change it. It includes a lot more translations. You could just look up, perhaps look up in Google, Modern English Bible Translations Compared. I would start with that, and it'd show you where these Bible translations fit in this chart. So let's review for a second. Over on the left, those are more literal, word for word, but they're difficult to read out loud. Sometimes it's just, you would understand it if you tried to read it. Way over on the other side, paraphrase. In the middle, tries to do a little bit of both. Thought for thought, word for word when possible. We saw with John chapter 1, verse 1, that the NIV was fairly close to the others. In the beginning was the Word. Wait, we didn't look that one up. We looked up John 1:14. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So the NIV. Now, one thing the new NIV does, they've changed it like 3 or 4 times. The NIV and things like the NRSV translations, NRSV, NIV, I'm not sure about these others. They have what's called gender neutralized the Bible. And so let's look at one that I'm thinking of that's probably true. 2 Corinthians 5:17. Oh, I'm in the ESV. Let me change that to the NIV. And then I will show you, change the screen, and you'll see what I mean. Okay. Let me change screen so you can just see what it does here. And so I don't like the new NIV as much, 2011 version. Most of us have memorized this verse. If anyone is in Christ, he is, actually, if any man is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come. Look what the NIV does. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. What they have done is they don't want to use male pronouns anymore. They have, and if there's something like brother or sister, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy. What is that? Romans 12, 1 and 2. I urge you, brothers and sisters. So they've added sisters here. And they will take like a single pronoun, he, and they will turn it to they. Well, I understand what they're trying to do and trying to be politically correct and trying to be inclusive in their language. But I would rather want to know what the Bible says exactly. And then I can do my own, application to brothers and sisters. So I don't like when they add words like this in the NIV. So if we just compared that to the ESV, let's see what the ESV does to it. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God. So it just keeps it literal and then has a footnote, brothers and sisters. I think that's kind of a new thing that they've added there. Well, I think it's obvious. I mean, if you read it, you know that it's including. Brothers was just a catch-all word. Included males, females, everyone. Paul was not just talking to the men there. Okay, so I think we're just about done with this. See if you have some comments or questions. Please be thinking of those. The last point here is that when a translation is made, in modern translation, it's usually done by a committee of people. For example, the NIV is translated mostly by evangelical scholars from around the world. So they will ask people to translate like a part of it. And then the whole committee will look at that translation. Sometimes committees can have biases. Sometimes, for example, some translations are very Catholic in how they do things. There are some translations, I think maybe the NASB, yeah, maybe the NASB, it's more open to like premillennialism. And so it will translate certain parts of like Revelation kind of from a premillennial perspective. So we have to be aware that these committees will come from a certain theological position. And so just be aware of that. That's why it's good to compare translations when you can. Well, let's talk about these big ideas and see if anyone has questions. Translation always involves interpretation about what words mean. The three languages of the Hebrew Bible, or the Bible, are Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Two important ancient translations of the Bible are the Septuagint, Greek, and Vulgate, Latin. Two primary approaches to Bible translation are called the formal, literal, and functional, thought for thought. We should be aware of the theological biases of the translators of different Bible versions. Here's the actual, I put in the notes the actual Greek and Hebrew alphabets if you'd like to look at those, but we don't need to take time for that. This chapter gets a little complicated, and it has a lot more details than what we really need to be concerned about at this level of interpretation. So I'm not going to go over all of the details in this chapter. You can read it through. I'm just going to hit the high points so that you have a kind of a basic idea of the history of interpretation. How have Christians interpreted the Bible at different periods of history? Why is it important to study how the Bible was interpreted in the past? We can see how God has worked through the church and people at different times, at different points. We can get a lot of wisdom, and we can learn a lot to help us in our own study. We can be careful that we don't make the same mistakes that people made in the past. But we can also learn from them so that we can make our interpretation today more accurate. Let's see. Yeah, you can just read through those. So, starting off with the early Jewish interpretation. We see some of it even as far back as the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy, and Exodus. Give some examples of how when God gave the law, then Moses went out and explained it to the people. We see in Deuteronomy, for example, an explanation of the Ten Commandments. It's an expansion and helping people understand it. Sometimes there are passages that in the Old Testament that have very similar wording. So for example, did Micah, the prophet, did he know Isaiah's prophecy? Micah came afterwards. So there's some similarities and differences there. Let's see. We'll keep going. There are two major events in the Old Testament. In the year 621 BC, the book of the law was discovered by King Josiah in the temple. It had been buried and it was covered with dust, and everyone had forgot about it. And so when Josiah brought the scriptures out, the scrolls of the law, and read it, it brought a revival to Judah. Another important event took place in 457 BC when Ezra, the scribe, came back from Babylon, and others came back as well. And Ezra used the Old Testament, especially the law, and he read it to the people and explained it to them. That's the passage we just read a few minutes ago, Nehemiah. And that resulted in another revival. Every time people get the Bible into their own language and they understand it and they read it, God's going to do something powerful. And we see that both times here in the Old Testament. After the Old Testament period, the rabbis began to develop as a group. They especially came out of Ezra's reforms, and that led into the scribes and the rabbinic movement by the first century when Jesus lived and the early disciples. The rabbis were teachers. The way that the rabbis read the Bible is that they would read a passage, and then they would look at what earlier rabbis taught about it. They would say, okay, Rabbi so-and-so said that this passage means this. Then they would add comments to it. And these comments became known as midrash. And eventually these were all collected into some of these Jewish writings called the Halakha, Haggadah. These different types of interpretations were included in the large document called the Mishnah and the Talmud. And these documents grew to be very big. You know, Christians are pretty good at writing commentaries. We inherited that from the Jews because they loved to write commentaries. So the Babylonian Talmud was 2,947 pages. There were 6,000 folio pages. That means individual leaves of parchment. 2.5 million words of commentary on the Old Testament. So quite a bit. That's huge. That's a lot of words. Commentary. So the Jews like to write commentary. So here's just some of the technical terms that describes their writings and their commentaries and how they interpreted. They developed different rules of interpretation. And these were written down and associated with Hillel. He was one of the most famous rabbis of the period, and then Shammai. And so these rabbis, their writings are described, their teachings are described in these ancient Jewish documents, the Pirkei Avot and Mishnah. They developed certain rules. And we can actually see many of these rules of interpretation followed in the New Testament because the earliest Christians were Jews. Paul the Apostle, this was what he learned in rabbi school, was how to interpret the Old Testament. So some of these get a little technical, and I don't want to go over it too much in detail, but we can see some of these in the New Testament. For example, the Kal Vachomer. What applies in a less situation will apply in a more important situation. Jesus used that a lot in his teaching. You know, if it's true here, how much more is this true? Paul the Apostle used that too. So if sin abounds, well, just compare that to the grace that abounds. So he's using this form of argument. Gezerah Shavah was another very common one. This is where you use analogy. So you have one idea and you explain it with some kind of analogy. Another one, yeah, most of these I'm not going to worry about because they get a little technical, but we can see these, not all of them, some of them a little hard to see, but the way that Paul the Apostle and the way that Jesus taught, they followed these rabbinic methods of interpreting the Bible and to present their ideas. Well, let's move on to the next major period, Hellenistic Judaism. And we'll do this and pause and go for a break. Hellenistic Judaism and the allegorical method. There are different centers of Jewish thought. A big one was in Babylon because that's where the Jews went during exile. Many of them stayed there. Another was when the Jews fled Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, they fled south to Egypt. So Babylon and Egypt became two centers of Judaism. The Jews that went to Alexandria, Egypt, were influenced by Greek thinking and by the philosophy of Plato. And they developed a method of interpretation called allegory. Allegory is where you look for a deeper meaning in a word than what's on the page. So what's on the page is just on the surface. And so that is actually talking about something deeper. And you have to discover what that deeper meaning is. The Jews of Alexandria, Egypt, developed this method. One of the most famous ones was Philo of Alexandria, and he lived during the years of Paul the Apostle. But they obviously didn't meet because Paul never went to Egypt. But Philo wrote a great big book. I have it in my library, I think. I'm not sure. A great big book of commentary and explanations. And he uses the allegorical method a lot. So he was influenced by Neoplatism. That was the new Plato that was developing. Influenced by Greek philosophers. So he taught that the Greek philosophers actually used Moses. So he was defending Jewish thought. He saw two levels of the text. There's the outer, literal husk. You peel that away, and then you find the inner spiritual kernel. Some challenges with the allegorical method. One problem is that it is subjective. That means the interpreter can determine whatever they want of what that deeper meaning is. So it leads to hermeneutical anarchy. What that means is that interpretive chaos. Because who is the authority is the interpreter, not the original author. It became very common among Jews and then later Christians, and we'll look at that after the break. And it took hold in the early church for many centuries. 20th century biblical interpretation has reacted against that. And so a lot of negative thoughts about the allegorical interpretation. And then finally, just the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran community. They had their own commentaries and interpretations of the Old Testament. And they would write in their books, they would say, they would have commentaries on the Old Testament, like the book of Habakkuk was one of their favorites. And so they would quote a passage in Habakkuk, and then they would use this Hebrew word, pesher, which means, this is what this means today. And then they would give their application in their own situation. So the Dead Sea Scrolls have their own form of commentary. Well, big ideas. Number one, it is important for us to study the history of interpretation so that we can learn new methods and avoid the mistakes of the people who lived in the past. Number two, Jewish interpretation followed many methods, including literal and allegorical. Number three, allegorization is when the details of a passage are given spiritual meaning. This method can be dangerous because the interpreter becomes the authority and may impose a meaning not intended by the original author. The early church. The early Christians followed the Jewish method of interpretation. They accepted the Old Testament as scripture. They interpreted the Old Testament from the lens of Jesus Christ, or what we'd call Christologically. They saw Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament, and that influenced how they interpreted the Old Testament. Back then, they viewed the oral communication as more influential than writing, because very few people could actually read and write, but everyone could listen. So they really focused on oral teaching. The New Testament authors, when they quote from the Old Testament, they're not so concerned about a word for word. Sometimes it's almost a paraphrase. Sometimes they change the wording of the Old Testament in their quotations. They had a free use of the text. That means sometimes they quote from memory, sometimes it's a loose paraphrase, sometimes they don't even consider the context of the original passage. They use the Septuagint, the Hebrew, and sometimes just their memory when they quote from the Old Testament. Jesus and his interpretation, he is always literal when he interpreted the Old Testament. He went with right what the passage said and meant. When he was fighting against the Pharisees, you could say, when he was debating them, that's a better way. When he was debating them, he rejected how they interpreted the Bible because they would add their own oral teaching to the Bible. And Jesus just went straight to the Old Testament. It is interesting that the scribes and Pharisees never questioned Jesus' interpretation of the Old Testament. They never questioned that. Jesus used the Old Testament in ways that we don't always understand it. But he followed those Jewish hermeneutical methods we talked about earlier. He followed those that were common during the day. He accepted the Old Testament as authoritative, and he knew the Old Testament very well. He quotes it in his teaching, and even when he was 12 years old, he amazed the people at the temple because of his knowledge. The early Christians followed some of these same methods, especially these ones I have laid out here. First of all, they had a very literalistic interpretation, just word for word, concept for concept, exactly as it was written. They also used this Pesher method that the Dead Sea Scrolls used. They would take the Old Testament text. Excuse me. Had to sneeze. They would take the Old Testament text and then apply it somehow to their own interpretation and how they saw the fulfillment in Jesus Christ. They would take a situation, one text, and apply what was in the less situation to the greater one. And so you can look up these passages if you like. Let's skip down to number 6, typology. They used typology. Typology is where you see a person in the Old Testament and they become a type for something in the New Testament. For example, Adam is a type for Jesus Christ, who becomes the second Adam. So Paul uses this typology in, for example, Romans chapter 5 and 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He talks about how we all died in Adam, but here comes the second Adam, Jesus Christ. So what happened in the Old Testament is it prefigures, or it is an example of what happens in the New Testament. It's called a type. So the original represents what we see in the present. And there's some different passages here. Allegory is another method. Paul uses allegory in Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 through 31. And he talks about how Hagar represents the Judaizers of Jerusalem, and Sarah represents the heavenly Jerusalem. So Paul was looking at the story of Hagar and Sarah, and he saw a deeper meaning to it. And that's what he writes about in the book of Galatians. So we do see some allegory also. Now, Paul the Apostle used the Old Testament a lot in his letters. And you can see how many quotations, 278. He uses a lot of different methods of interpretation, just like all of those rabbinic methods that we looked at a moment ago. But he also has some freedom because he believed that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. So he quotes from the Hebrew Bible, he quotes from the Septuagint, and sometimes he just quotes from the memory because it doesn't match anything exactly. So Paul uses the Old Testament a lot. The Epistle of Hebrews also uses the Old Testament a lot, especially certain passages like Psalm 110 and Jeremiah 31, the passage on the New Covenant. It uses allegory, analogical, we'll talk about that in a moment, typological interpretation. He uses different methods. So we'll talk about those in the early church, and hopefully it'll be clear in a moment. The summary of the methods in the New Testament. There's the literal, contextual. They looked at the Old Testament, the context, and interpreted it very literally for their situation. Typological. The authors looked at a reference in the Old Testament and saw how God worked back then, and they saw how God worked in Jesus in their time. And they saw a comparison. And this was a typology. And then the biggest principle was the application. The underlying principle of a passage is used to apply to a new and comparable situation, especially when they saw the Old Testament was fulfilled in the New Testament. We see that a lot in the Gospels, for example, and how Jesus was the fulfillment of what the Old Testament talked about. 3 key ideas. The early Christians read the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus Christ. They saw Jesus as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. That's important there. Jesus was the fulfillment of the Old Testament. The early Christians followed the methods of Jews, and then later on they added some of the methods from the Greco-Roman world. It gets a little complex with all of that, but it helps explain, by the way, knowing some of this helps explain some of those difficult passages, because then we understand what they were doing and why they quoted something the way they did. Just a couple of weeks ago, I did a study of Romans chapter 9 through 11. I had never really studied that passage in depth. It was always a little confusing, very challenging. And I looked at how Paul quotes the Old Testament. He quotes the Old Testament more there than anywhere else in his letters. I forget how many times, like 30 or 40 times, he quotes the Old Testament in those 3 chapters. And very interesting, very kind of, I'm not sure if I came up with the right ideas yet, but it's very interesting how Paul uses the Old Testament, and that's his method of interpretation, is that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. And then let's move on in church history some more to the patristic exegesis. This covers from about the time of Clement of Rome up until Augustine and into the 5th century, and so about 590 or so. First of all, the apostolic period, the period right after the apostles. There are some major changes going on at this time. The church was becoming more Gentile, so they were not using the methods of the Jews anymore, but now they were using more of the Greco-Roman methods that were used in other ways throughout the Roman Empire. During this time, the New Testament books took on the same authority as the Old Testament. So now there was the Old Testament and New Testament, and they all became Scripture. Then, number 3, or C, the allegorical method began to be used more and more. And actually, it was positive because it helped the church use the Old Testament. There are many things in the Old Testament that seemed very foreign and did not make sense to the early Christians. And so they allegorized the Old Testament. And that really saved the Old Testament for the church. Otherwise, they may have just rejected the Old Testament. They had three primary methods during this time of interpretation. Typology, how, especially in relationship to Jesus and to their ethics. Allegory began to be used more and more, and it was used to support church doctrine. It became the most common method of interpretation. One of the favorite passages was the parable of the Good Samaritan. So they took that parable, and each part of the parable had different meanings. For example, the oil represented the Holy Spirit, the bandage represented something, and it just went on and on and on. The problem was that there were so many interpretations because anyone could come up with an idea, which is the problem with allegory. And then a more traditional approach. In other words, what has the church taught about this passage? And so the early church fathers would quote each other, see what the earlier church fathers wrote, and so on. So they wanted to interpret the New Testament and Old Testament orthodox. What has the church taught? The traditional approach. So there's different interpreters here. We won't go over too many of them. Clement of Rome, he is one of the earliest, just right after the apostles. Ignatius of Antioch, he is another very early one. Both of these brothers wrote letters, and they quoted like Paul's letters and other early Christian writings in the writings that they had. So like Ignatius, he doesn't quote very much from the Old Testament, but he does from the New Testament, especially Paul's letters. So we can see how these very early Christians interpreted. What was their method of interpretation? Ignatius, for example, he believed the bishop was responsible. So very authoritative. Whoever was the bishop had the authority to say what a passage meant. There are some challenges during this period. One of those is Marcion. Marcion rejected the Old Testament, and he had a very limited New Testament, and he was later rejected as a heretic. But he interpreted the New Testament as a Gnostic, which was one of the early heresies. Montanus believed in new prophetic revelations, that the Spirit was speaking through him. And so he would come up with new interpretations. The age of the Spirit has come, and you pray, and the Holy Spirit brings new interpretations to you. So you can see potentially how that might be a problem. Because again, who's the authority? It's the Spirit-filled prophet. And so this could become a danger as well. Both of these people were rejected by the church. And then as time went on, other early church fathers, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Tertullian, they had their different methods. And this led to kind of an ongoing debate that still happens today between faith and reason. This becomes important. This is one of the most important things in church history when it comes to interpreting the Bible. So there were two centers of Christianity that developed. One of those was in Alexandria, Egypt. And remember, a few minutes ago, we looked at the Jew who lived there. His name was Philo. And Philo emphasized allegory. Well, as Christianity grew, that became a center of Christianity also. And so the early Christians from Alexandria, Egypt, also emphasized allegorical interpretation. So one of those was called Clement of Alexandria. And then another famous one was Origen. So Clement said that a scripture passage has two parts to it. The body, which is the literal, but that body of it points to the deeper soul, which is hidden. And you have to dig deeper to get to the spiritual truth. Origen had three levels to the text: body, soul, and spirit. So the body is the literal, historical. The soul is the moral or the ethical teaching, and the spiritual is the doctrinal truths in a passage. So this was fairly influential in parts of the church, the allegorical method. And then the other center of Christianity was Antioch. Antioch followed what's called the grammatical historical interpretation. That's where you look at the grammar, you look at the context, you look at the history, very much like we do today. In fact, Antioch, this perspective has won the day in modern biblical studies. So we very much follow the Antiochian grammatical historical. They wanted the literal. They did not like all this fanciful ideas that the Alexandrians came up with. They wanted to stick to what the literal said and to then apply that literal meaning to their own situation. So we have these two different perspectives, and these two perspectives actually carry on throughout church history and even today in one way or another. Well, the next part of this period was also the church councils. And here they began to especially focus on the teachings of the fathers. And they would actually write these interpretations in the margins of their Bibles. And so the teachings and the interpretations of the early church fathers became the authority for the interpretation. So let's look at these key ideas. Exegesis was more flexible and less controlled during the early church. The church was just developing. They did not have universities and so on. I mean, it just, if you had the Bible, you interpreted it the best you could. A new academic level of interpretation was being developed in these two centers, Antioch of Syria and Alexandria, Egypt. Antioch emphasized the grammatical, historical, literal. The Alexandria said, learn what the church fathers said and use allegory. Interpretation was also used by heretics. The Arian controversy. This is a lesson for church history. A lot of those debates were focused on how do you interpret the apostles in the New Testament. So a lot of the issues in the early church were related to interpretation. Interpretation was rather conservative during those times, but allegory was growing and would become a challenge in some places. So basically, we can boil it down to 2 points. And I have it summarized here, Aristotle and Plato, but don't worry about that. It was a debate between a historical approach or reason, and then a spiritual approach and faith. So there's kind of like a pendulum that would swing between these over the years. Well, medieval interpretation. The biggest method during this period of time, for over 1,000 years, was that people just quoted the church fathers. There was really nothing major that was done for these thousands of years. This was the Dark Ages. They did not develop much new methods of interpretation during that period. Allegory continued to grow in its influence and became the dominant approach of interpretation. So they developed 4 levels of allegory. The literal, what the word actually meant. Allegorical or doctrinal, more of a symbolic interpretation. A moral, how a person should respond. And the anagogical, here's that word that appeared earlier. Or eschatological, how the passage refers to heavenly realities. Anagogy means ideal or the spiritual sense. So the classical example is the city Jerusalem. The literal meaning, Jerusalem is the ancient city in Palestine. The allegorical interpretation is that the city represents the Christian church. The moral sense is that it represents the soul of the believer. And then the anagogical sense, it represents the heavenly city. So you can see with just the very name of Jerusalem, how there could be different interpretations of it. When you read a passage in the New Testament, well, what Jerusalem is it? Is it the New Jerusalem? Is it the Jerusalem of my soul? Or is it the city in Palestine? There was a famous rhyme in the Latin in the 16th century that went something like this. The letter shows us what God our Father did. The allegory shows us where our faith is hid. The moral meaning gives us rules of daily life. The anagogy shows us where we end our strife. Another major influence during this time were the mystics. They would go to monasteries and they would read the Bible in spiritual ways, for devotional ways. And a lot of their writings have been preserved. This way of reading the Bible is known as Lectio Divina, spiritual reading. We might do a little bit of that at the end of the class if we have time. But this is still practiced today. It's reading the Bible and trying to find spiritual meaning from it. Not using all these complicated debates and all that, just simply reading the Bible and listening to it. And so this became well known in the monasteries among the Christian mystics. And then the school of Antioch still continued on. It can be seen in people like Thomas Aquinas, who wrote a massive book called the Summa Theologica. And so he attempted to free the church from the hold of allegory. And he thought that the interpretations were not accurate anymore. And he tried to go back to the literal interpretation. So, quick review here. This period used the tradition of the church fathers as proof texts for interpretation. The people continued to use allegory. The mystical tradition continued to emphasize devotional reading. And the historical approach did not completely disappear, but it began to develop later in the Middle Ages. Then we come to an important time period, the Reformation. This really deserves an entire hour just in itself, but we can only do it just briefly. As people began to rethink things, beginning in the 14th century, Europe became fascinated with ancient Greek and Roman thought. They went back to the philosophers, and they began to rethink things, and intellectual study began to happen more. And out of the Renaissance developed the scientific method that we'll look at in just a moment. So people were beginning to look at the Bible more scientifically, more carefully during the Renaissance period. Also, there was a discovery or re-emphasis upon the biblical languages. For 1,000 years, the church used the Latin Vulgate. And you can imagine that the average person had no idea what it meant. Very few people in the Middle Ages ever read the Bible. Only a few priests who probably didn't know the Latin anyway themselves. So hardly anyone ever used the Bible to study. And so many translations were not very accurate. So there was a reemergence of the ancient biblical texts. People began to learn Hebrew and Greek, which meant that they could now translate it. Also, the science of textual criticism developed as more and more people, or more and more manuscripts were discovered. And they began to compare the manuscripts. And they found out that some of the early manuscripts that they translated from were not the best. So some parts of the Latin Vulgate were not so accurate because the manuscripts they used were not so quality. So a lot of this new thinking developed. One big influence, or two big influences, these are probably the biggest. Number one was the invention of the printing press. Now the Bible could be mass-produced. No longer was it only like one Bible for one cathedral, and only the priests who knew Latin could read it. Now, everyone could have a Bible if they could, just have a few pesos. The second thing which went along with this is the translation of the Bible into the languages of Europe. One of the biggest things that Martin Luther did was to translate the Bible into everyday German. And then later on, it was translated into to French, and eventually into English, and then into Spanish. And this brought about, probably more than anything else, the Protestant Reformation. People now could have the Bible in their own language, and they could read it. And then along comes Martin Luther. He was a scholar. He studied the Greek and Hebrew, and he translated the Greek and Hebrew into his own language, German. And then he printed that, and it brought about a revival. For Martin Luther, Scripture was primary. No longer did he appeal to the church fathers, but he went straight back to Scripture. That's why we say Scripture alone, not anyone else's interpretation. Everyone could read it for themselves now. The focus of his Scripture interpretation was salvation in Jesus Christ. So Luther rejected allegory. He saw it as empty speculation. It was just people's ideas, wild and crazy. Let's read the Bible literally. Martin Luther, along with John Calvin, both of those people were excellent Bible interpreters. And they wrote commentaries, which are still used today, by the way. And so Martin Luther said, let's get back to the original biblical languages. And so he taught people how to use the historical context, to study the grammar, to study the context, the literary context. So many of the methods we follow today, they go back to Martin Luther. And he started those. He saw Jesus as the focus of the Bible. The Old Testament points to Jesus. The New Testament reflects back on Jesus. And so, and then maybe one more thing is the Holy Spirit is very important, essential in interpretation. The Holy Spirit works within us to help us understand the Bible. The Bible is inspired for us today through the Holy Spirit. So there's a few other points you can read there, but you can tell, and maybe later on when we go through our own method, you'll realize that these are not new. Actually, this is what Martin Luther emphasized. And it's through this that he discovered justification by faith, because he went back to the Bible and read it himself. And he discovered it as he read the book of Romans. John Calvin, also a very good interpreter of the Bible. He went back to the original languages. He saw that the Bible is written by both humans and God, dual authorship. Christ is the focus. Illumination by the Holy Spirit. Many of the same ideas as Martin Luther. He also rejected allegory. And he was aware of the literary nature of the Bible, and he interpreted it as literature. So he followed some of those principles of Luther, very similar in their ideas. Scripture is clear. Use logic and reason to interpret it. You don't need all this fancy spiritual allegory. Just read what it says. You don't need to try to over-interpret it. Interpret it. Okay, so let's move on down to the post-Reformation period. There was a period known as Protestant scholasticism. During this period, the idea of inerrancy developed, and the dictation theories of inspiration, that God controlled the original authors, and every single letter that they wrote, God directed them to write. This scholasticism and way of thinking, some of this also led to doctrinal wars. And actually, doctrinal wars led to actual physical wars during that period. Another major thing that developed during this time was the rise of rationalism. This influenced interpretation quite significantly. It was after the Protestant Reformation and into the 1600s and 1700s that the scientific method began to develop. This is known as the scientific revolution. People began to question everything. It was cause and effect. Everything had to have a cause, a reason. And people took this scientific perspective and applied it to the Bible. And so there was a growing separation now. Before this, it was very much, interpretation was very much spiritual, done in the church by the scholars. Now there began to be a separation. And there were secular scholars, scientists, who began to question things like the miracles in the Bible. Well, how do you know that? Prove it to me. And so they began to ask these questions of the Bible. And this went on to be developed in the 1800s, in Europe especially. Well, as you can imagine, the church reacted against that. And there was a movement called Pietism that developed. They wanted to get back to the spiritual reading of the Bible. Pietism, by the way, very significantly influenced John Wesley. John Wesley was part of the Pietistic movement. And so, emphasizing a spiritual, theological reading of the Bible, not these scientific questions. So Pietism emphasized a grammatical study that led to devotional application. We can see that in John Wesley's writings. Rationalism emphasized that reason was the way to understand the world. If you cannot prove it, then it probably didn't happen. So people were raising all kinds of questions about, like, how could the Red Sea be divided? I mean, tell me about that. It's like, well, it says it right here in the Bible. Well, prove it to me scientifically. So people began to raise these questions, and it grew into some of the universities. So let's jump on down to the 19th and 20th centuries. Well, maybe let's summarize this real quick, the big ideas. Okay, so try not to get lost in all these details. I have lots more information here than what we need right now, but you can read it through and kind of use this as a textbook reference if you want to study any one of these things more deeply. The big ideas. Allegorization gives a spiritual meaning to the details of a passage and was followed by some Jews and the school of Alexandria. The school of Antioch emphasized a more historical, grammatical interpretation, more literal. The early Christians read the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus Christ. The early Christians followed the methods of the Jews, and then later they began to add on the Greco-Roman methods. During the Middle Ages, the early church fathers were used as the authority to interpret the Bible. Number 6, the mystical traditions continued to emphasize devotional reading. Number 7, access to the original biblical languages and translation into modern languages brought a new level of understanding of the Bible, leading to the Protestant Reformation. People began to have the Bible in their own language, and they could read it for themselves for the first time. The Reformers saw Jesus as the focus of the Bible, and they used the grammatical historical approach. They rejected the allegory. They saw it as empty speculation and wild and crazy ideas. Number 9, rationalism challenged the miraculous claims of the Bible. Number 10, pietism emphasized the grammatical study leading to devotional application. So that covers 1,800 years of church history in those few points. I hope you're starting to see just how the Bible was used through different periods of church history. People did not just have the Bible and read it like we do today. They may have heard it a little bit in the chapels, but most people had no idea what the Bible was about. And so once people began to have their own Bibles, they began to see how God wanted them to live. Let's go on then to modern methods of interpretation. Skipping now to the 19th century. This is going to build on what we just talked about. So in the Enlightenment period, the 19th century was a period of scientific advancement. This included things like archaeology. Many ancient manuscripts, very important manuscripts, were discovered in monasteries in the Middle East. Biblical interpreters tried to be objective and scientific. And this led to what is known as the historical critical method. This was a little different than what Calvin and Wesley used. It denied the theological interpretation. They were just trying to interpret the Bible as grammar, as history, ancient Israel as a people. There was no longer a connection to Jesus and application for today. The Bible was just read and interpreted as an ancient text of ancient Hebrew and the early church. There was no longer an application. This began to take place especially in the universities of Europe, Germany, and other places. Human reason was the best tool to interpret the Bible. They treated the Bible like any other ancient book. They had a naturalistic worldview. They used the laws of nature. And so if there was some kind of supernatural claim like angels or the parting of the Red Sea or the water being changed into wine, they denied all that because it could not be proven scientifically. So let's jump down. So some of these other methods that I'm going to talk about get a little complex. So I'm not going to talk about all of them in great detail, just a few of them. So these scholars who were becoming very scientific developed a method known as source criticism. They began to interpret the Bible scientifically, and they began to see that there were different breaks or seams, S-E-A-M. Like on a shirt, you have a seam that separates. They saw separations in the Bible where it seemed like there were two people writing. And so there are different theories that developed about sources, original resources that the Bible writers used to write their final version. The most famous of those was developed by Julius Wellhausen, became known as the JEDP hypothesis. He saw in the Pentateuch that there were 4 different sources. Elohim, because certain places in the Pentateuch uses different names for God. And so he developed this hypothesis, which became very influential. So most scholars today, source criticism is not very helpful for us as Bible interpreters today. During this period, there was some very helpful things that were done. For example, they studied the ancient manuscripts. Archaeology really made a lot of progress. People would go to the Holy Land or to Egypt, and they would discover how the ancient people lived. So there was a lot of good things that happened, but some things are not very helpful for us today, like source criticism. It's meaningless, really. I don't use it. So let's jump now to the 20th century. The 20th century was a time when there's so much discovery about the Bible, and there's so many new methods. It becomes overwhelming to think of how many things that were discovered. Many, many books were written by the Bible, about the Bible. Our libraries are full of them now. The 20th century was a rich time of Bible study on every level, from the very scientific studies, archaeology, language. It was during this period that lexicons were written on Greek and Hebrew. Many great discoveries were done during this time, but also on the level of devotion and in the churches. Revivals were taking place during this time. So the 20th century was a great time of progress when it comes to the Bible study. There was a shift from historical towards the end of the 20th century. Well, first of all, I should stick to my notes here. The historical critical method that was used in the universities in the 19th century led to where people compared religions at the beginning of the 20th century. So they would compare ancient Israel, for example, to ancient Canaanite religions. They compared, for example, Paul's writings, and they saw how he was very similar to the mystery religions. So it seemed like Paul was influenced more by the Greco-Roman world during the first half of the 20th century. The last half of the 20th century, people began to see that Paul was influenced more by Judaism. And so there was a new emphasis at the end of the 20th century, just a few decades ago, that Paul was more of a Jew than a Roman. And so there was a swing within my lifetime. Another thing that was done during this time was that people tried to understand who Jesus was. In the 19th century, there was what's called a quest or a search for the historical Jesus. This is all kind of seminary level stuff, so we'll kind of skip it. So they used all of these different methods to do that. So let's kind of skip through some of this. One helpful method that can be used is redaction criticism. About the middle of the 20th century, a new method was developed where scholars would compare. This is especially used in the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They began to see how each of the writers had their own way of saying things. And they would compare the three gospels, and they would line up the passages, literally line them up in columns. I have a website here that will show that. It's called the Gospel Parallels. And you can click on that website right here, and it will do it for you. Put in a passage, and it will put columns for you. And they begin to see that Luke, for example, he emphasized certain things in his gospel that Matthew and Mark don't have. Matthew has certain passages and certain words and vocabulary that Mark and Luke don't have. And so scholars began to realize that Luke had a certain message. Mark has a certain message. Matthew has a certain message. And this is called redaction criticism. Redaction means editing. How the authors of the New Testament, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, how they took the traditions of the early church and they wrote them down in a certain way. So that became one useful method. We could still use that in our own studies today, but it's not usually done, for a sermon or a Bible study. But maybe if you're doing a deeper study, you might get into that. We'll skip composition criticism. That's not very common. And then another movement is called biblical theology movement. Scholars such as Karl Barth read the Bible and came up with theological teaching and statements. Then after World War II, this began to be emphasized more and more. So If you go look in the library, you'll see that around 1940, 1950, 1960, there's a whole bunch of books that were written on a theology of the New Testament, a theology of the Old Testament. And so, I have probably 3 or 4 in my own library that were written in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. They're still written today, but that was kind of when these started to develop. People looked at the whole Bible, and they began to see how the whole theology is developed. In fact, in our own Nazarene world, we have one that's called God, Man, and Salvation by Kaiser and Taylor. If you haven't read it, it's a pretty good book. It's about that thick. You can actually get that free now at the Wesleyan Holiness Digital Library. I think it's free. But it's a biblical theology. And it was written, I think, in the 1970s or maybe in the 1980s. Nazarenes, we tend to be behind times a little bit. It takes us a little while to catch up with everybody else. But we have our own biblical theology. Biblical theology helps us answer the big questions, like what is God's plan of salvation? Who is Jesus? The book that we have, our Nazarene book, God, Man, Salvation, 3 parts to it. Talks about God, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. What does the Bible teach about them? About mankind. Who are we? How are we created in the image of God? So it has a whole section on that. And then it talks about sin and salvation from a biblical perspective, not systematic theology like the theologians do, but from the way of a Bible scholar. I love biblical theology. It's my favorite. I love to look at what the Bible teaches about theology and put it all together. So I like the method called biblical theology. Another method that developed in the 20th century was archaeology. There were a lot of discoveries made. Sometimes what happened is like wealthy Westerners would go to someplace like Egypt. They would dig up a tomb of a pharaoh, and then they would take the mummy and all these artifacts back to some museum in Europe or perhaps the United States later on. And so they basically kind of robbed the Middle East of all their ancient artifacts. So you can go to like the British Museum, and someplace in their basement, they have all these ancient artifacts. Have you seen that movie, Night at the Museum? I think there's like 2 or 3 versions of it now. Well, that's kind of what happened if you haven't seen that movie before. But, these ancient artifacts come to life. And, it's all make-believe. But really, that's what happened, is that a lot of these artifacts were taken to the museums of the world. Well, in the process of all of that, they would bring these things back to their places and they would study them. Or they would go to the ancient site and they would dig it up and study how, the rocks were laid out. Sometimes there would be a pile of ash. There might be some bones. There might be some pottery here. And based on all of this evidence, they would try to discover how the ancient people lived. And this is the way that they would date ancient cities. They would look at the pottery and the style that it was made and so on. So archaeology was very helpful. A lot of what we have today in our Bible studies, we owe to the discovery of archaeology. I always thought it would be interesting to go to like the Holy Land and dig up, some ancient piece of pottery or something. But I had a nephew who did that one summer, and he said it was so hot, and they got down on their hands and knees with a brush, like a toothbrush, all summer long, scraping away the dirt. I changed my mind after that. I thought, well, that doesn't sound very fun to me. But some people do that. They spend their whole lifetime digging up things. One thing about archaeology, though, everything has to be interpreted. You can imagine you have a piece of pottery and you are able to put together a halfway decent pot. Well, what can you tell about the people? You have to interpret that pot. Sometimes there's disagreement among the archaeologists, but sometimes there's very interesting discoveries that they make. I used to get in the mail a magazine called Biblical Archaeology magazine. Very interesting. I think it's online today. If you're interested in the ancient world, you can find a lot of interesting things on the internet now about biblical archaeology. Okay, we move into the 20th century. Beginning around 1970, this is my lifetime. I was born in 1966. So within my lifetime now, there is a new emphasis in biblical studies. These debates about the historicity of the Bible and some of the questions about the historical Jesus and debates of authorship and dating and all of that, it kind of wore out. In other words, people realize that sometimes we just don't have the answers. And so when I talk about biblical study, I'm talking about in the universities around the world. There began to be a new emphasis, and that was on the Bible as literature. People began to look, they moved away from the Bible as history to the Bible as written that we have. It's a piece of literature. They began to use literary methods that were used in other fields like poetry and study of grammar and things like that. They took all of those and they began to apply them to the Bible. Many more insights were developed since 1970. Thousands of very interesting books have been written. One method that developed is canonical criticism. This is what the word criticism is used in all of these. It doesn't mean being critical, where you look down on someone. Criticism means a scientific approach. That's what it means. So a scientific approach to the canon. The canon is the word that means the Bible that we have received. This is the canon of Scripture. We don't need to break it apart like some of the scholars did back in the 19th century. We don't need to get our scissors out and say this part was written by Paul, but this part wasn't. Or these letters are authentic and these aren't. We don't need to do that. This is the Bible the church has received and believed is inspired. This is what we need to study. We don't need to take it apart. So this is called canonical criticism. And so this is the Bible that the church has accepted as the authority. This was a response to all of these other kinds of ideas that had gone around. This can be helpful a little bit for exegesis, but not really for Bible study and so on. I mean, I don't think about it. This is the Bible. I read it. So canonical criticism is not real helpful. Now, this next method is very helpful. Rhetorical criticism. So beginning in the 19th centuries, people began to see how the writers of the Bible would present their ideas. This is called presenting an argument. Like when you are in a debate and you present your ideas in a logical format, or if you go to a court of law and you have a lawyer, your lawyer wants to present your case, so the lawyer will lay out an argument, okay? So rhetoric tries to find out how an author tries to persuade or convince the audience of his ideas. This has been applied especially to like Paul's letters, and it's just like opened up all kinds of things. And I've used this a lot in my studies. So the way to ask that, we need to ask a question. What is the biblical author trying to convince his audience, readers, of his ideas? What methods is he using? So scholars began to use ancient Greco-Roman methods. in the ancient world, rhetoric was the number one topic of study. When you went to like high school, what did you learn? You learned rhetoric. What did Paul learn when he went to school? He learned rhetoric. And so his letters are laid out very systematically sometimes. So they even had handbooks that were developed that had all these rules laid out. So Paul's letters especially show a lot of similarity with ancient Greco-Roman rhetoric. And if we know what to look for, it answers a lot of questions about Paul's letters that otherwise could be confusing. And then sometimes scholars will use modern rhetorical theory, and they will apply that to any part of the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, Gospels, and so on. So there's many methods now, lots of them, about rhetorical criticism. Now it's overwhelming of what to do. But sometimes this method can be helpful because we can ask questions. So why does Paul say in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, I am writing this to shame you? And then he gets into it. We'll skip letter J. That's not too common. J and K. Another method that is very helpful for us today in our Bible study is called narrative criticism. So out of the study of the Bible as literature in the 1970s, people began to interpret the Bible as a story. Now, every story has parts to it. A good story has a plot. A plot has conflict between the good guy, the protagonist, and the bad guy, the antagonist. You might remember this from studying it in high school or someplace. And then there's always the setting of the scene. And then the conflict kind of goes up. It rises. And then at the end, it resolves. Every good movie has conflict. My wife, when I watch a movie, it's a really good movie, she'll feel my hand because I get all sweaty and excited because, I'm into the plot. And so at the end, the plot is resolved. It is ended. If it's a happy ending, then the hero wins. Sometimes the hero loses. And if it's a happy ending, it's called a comedy. If it's a bad ending, it's called a tragedy. Well, people took these ideas and they began to apply it to the Bible, especially stories in the Gospels. Narrative criticism is very helpful for looking at the stories about Jesus. For example, in Mark chapter 4, Jesus is out on the boat with his disciples. We're going to run out of time. I don't really have time to go into that, but we have the scene. They're out in a boat. It's stormy. The conflict. The boat's about to sink. We have the characters. Jesus is the good guy. The disciples, they're kind of in between. And the bad guy is actually the storm. The bad guy, the antagonist, doesn't have to be a person. It could be like a storm, a disease, demon possession. And so it looks like this is going to be a tragedy because the disciples think the boat is going to sink. And then Jesus calms the storm. The conflict looks like the boat is going to sink. All of a sudden, Jesus calms the storm. And that's the end. It's a good, happy ending. Actually, there's a little bit more to it because that small story is part of a bigger story. And so it can get quite complex when it comes to the stories of the Gospels. But we can use these kinds of questions to go and look at the stories in the Bible because they will follow the same pattern. A good story has been the same forever. A good storyteller knows these things and knows about how to make a story exciting. Maybe you might add a few props in the story. Props are the things like in a play, the scene and so on. So you add all that into a good story and people are excited, they're listening. And then at the end, You want it to come to a good ending for the hero. So this has been very helpful in biblical studies, narrative criticism. Intertextual criticism, that's where how the New Testament authors will quote the Old Testament and how they did that. So that's kind of advanced. We won't worry about that. Another very helpful method is called social scientific criticism. This criticism, this approach, this methodology uses social sciences and applies those to the Bible. They look at different models and ways of thinking in the ancient world. And there's several ancient models. For example, honor and shame. Honor and shame are very powerful ways of thinking in Asia, for example, today. It was also true in the ancient world, honor and shame. So a person could read parts of the Bible and see how people are shamed, or what is the position of honor. For example, when Paul writes his letters, he believes that his position is the one of honor, and he wants his readers to agree with him because he agrees with Jesus. The way of honor is the way of Christ. If you do not follow Jesus Christ, then you are in the place of shame. And so Paul writes his letters to get people away from that. So that's a way to approach the Bible. It can be very helpful. And there's actually a whole commentary series that's called the Social Scientific Commentary on the New Testament. And it looks at each book of the New Testament. A lot of helpful insights in that. And then one last one is theological interpretation. This is probably what we do mostly in the church today, as we try to find the theology and the message of the text. Now, some people have developed this into more of a science, but theological interpretation doesn't really need explanation because as Nazarenes, we want to know what God is saying in the Bible. We've been doing this the whole time. But in some places, like in the universities, they don't always do this. But in the church, we emphasize theological interpretation because we want to know the method. So where are we going in the future with all of this? Well, one thing that has been developing in the last decade or two is cultural exegesis. For example, there's now a commentary series called the Asian Commentary of the New Testament. So the New Testament is being interpreted from an Asian perspective. There's an African perspective. There's a Marxist perspective coming out of South America. There might be a Filipino commentary series soon. Maybe not, I don't know. Maybe one of you will write it. But it's people who are writing their interpretation from the perspective of their culture. Okay? So sometimes it's very helpful. When I was teaching APNTS and I had like 10 different cultures in the room and we were studying a passage, very interesting to see how the different students were interpreting the Bible from their own cultural perspective. So cultural exegesis is developing. As the church grows into other parts of the world, we'll see more and more interpretation from a cultural perspective. Another one I call agenda exegesis. And some of this is really not good. For example, you can go do a research on this, but there's now a queer interpretation method, a LGBT exegesis. So people are interpreting the Bible from their own agenda. So they're trying to prove, for example, homosexuality. And they're interpreting the Bible from that perspective. So a lot of this negative. It's bad because they are imposing their own ideas on the Bible. So be a little careful of that. I don't think you will be exposed to it most of the time in the local church. But if you're doing research on the internet, for example, you might come across a website that actually is pushing an agenda. So you have to be very careful and be aware of that. And then there's one final one I want to emphasize, and I'm calling it the mission exegesis. And this is what we in the Church of the Nazarene are emphasizing, because we want to fulfill the Great Commission. And so we interpret the Bible from the perspective that God wants us to use this Bible to further the message of the gospel. And so I'm calling this a missional focus. And we want to know, what is God's mission for me as I read the Bible? It's not just simply reading the Bible for me spiritually to grow me individually. No, I'm reading the Bible to see what God's mission is in the world. And so it's a little bit different approach than all these other ones. Okay, so how do I summarize all this? We just covered 2,000 years of interpretation. It's overwhelming, isn't it? I'm overwhelmed with it. What do we do with all this information? Well, these methods will help us to ask different questions of the Bible. The most important thing when it comes to interpreting the Bible, when it comes to methodology, the most important thing is learning to ask good questions. The more we study all of these different methods throughout church history, the more precise our questions can be. For example, archaeology. It helps us ask the question of, how did those ancient people live? We read a passage about Ruth, and we read how she went out into the fields, and she did the harvest, and after the people had gone through. Well, if we study some archaeology and some of the ancient cultures, that will help us interpret that passage more. And so we ask those questions, and archaeology helps us answer them. Let's take another perspective. So we're studying one of Paul's letters, and he tells the Corinthians, I write this to shame you. Well, we can use sociology to help us understand, social scientific criticism to help us understand that. Well, also, Paul will say, I do not want you to be divided. You know, and some of you are eating the Eucharist and you're getting drunk, and the others are going hungry. Well, we can use some of our modern methods to read that passage and understand it better. Or we might read a parable of Jesus, and we can use narrative criticism. And we can ask, okay, who's the key character in the Good Samaritan story? Who is the bad guys? You know, the Levite, the priest. What is the plot structure? And what happens to it? We see how it looks like the man who is beaten, he's going to die out there on the road. This is a bad ending. All of a sudden, here comes the Good Samaritan. He's the good guy. And so we interpret that story looking at these certain elements. And now we have a bigger understanding of the story. Okay? So these methods can be helpful. It's like becoming a doctor. Okay? Our time is up. So it's like becoming a doctor. A doctor does more than just simply check your temperature. Right now in your Bible study, maybe all you can do is check your temperature. But the more you study, the more you'll be able to listen to the heart and tell when there's what do they call those things? A faulty valve or something, you know? You can listen to the stomach and tell if there's an ulcer. You'll be able to cut open the body and be able to perform open heart surgery. Well, you cannot do that if you only go to school 1 year. But if you go to school for 10 years, then you can do it. So right now, you're just learning to check the temperature. But if you stick at it, the world is open to you. I mean, there's so much. You can write a whole book on one verse. Do you know that? I've seen entire books written on one verse because they get so detailed and they use all these different approaches. And it's so enriching doing that.